Mario has achieved superstardom, exploding as if from nowhere into the stratosphere. The man was fearless. He became a legend, and the legend became history. Mario had conquered the world. I started this series thinking that I would reach the Super Nintendo era in a single hour. In reality, I discovered that there were far more games than I initially realized, and by the time I got to the 7th or 8th port of Donkey Kong, I said to myself that if I ever saw Donkey Kong in real life, I would just punch him in the face. The series quickly expanded far beyond the scope of just Mario the man and the game, and it expanded towards the evolution of the greater video game medium and industry, by which I mean Donkey Kong ports. Today's episode brings Mario out of the living room and into the big wide world, but this time he doesn't come with a watch. That's right, I'm talking batteries, I'm talking cartridges, I'm talking boys. Boy. But first we gotta work our way up through the rest of the Donkey Kong ports. Starting with a really weird one that I discovered in my travels. It's Donkey Kong Jr. for the ZX Spectrum, or ZX Spectrum. It is British. It's like YYZ versus YYZ. Wikipedia's list of games featuring Mario does not mention it, and the information that I have managed to find is very limited. The only thing I've seen consistently is that it came out in 1984, but the validity of even that fact seems dubious. I've seen a couple of things say that it's officially unreleased, which would explain the limited information, so perhaps you could consider this a bonus feature. Donkey Kong Jr. for the Spectrum follows Jr., who is now this weird long-armed ape thing who has a chilling blood-red complexion, almost like he crawled out of a creepypasta from 2012. Well, if you're playing this game expecting hyper-realistic blood and dolls flying out of the computer monitor, no such thing happened in my playthrough, so you're probably gonna be disappointed. But it is an interesting game, albeit a wonky port and definitely not as good as its contemporaries. Controls-wise, it's a little stiff, and the game speed also changes completely depending on what level you're playing. I guess it's tied to the complexity of the environment. Unfortunately, I didn't make it past level 2, but if I was having this much trouble on the first 2 levels, I'd probably have a stroke trying to get through Mario's hideout. Up next, we got Donkey Kong for our old friend, the Commodore 64, who will not stop partying until the day he dies. I guess you could say this was the original DK64. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, we already talked about this. Which, yeah, we did. But you see, they made another one. Because what the world really needed in 1986 was more ports of Donkey Kong. If you ever lay in bed at night wondering why it is that they don't make Donkey Kong games anymore, this is why. They're still burnt out from all the ports they made. And if you're burnt out on hearing about Donkey Kong stuff by now, just imagine how I feel, cause I actually had to play them all. This version is definitely better than the first Commodore version, probably because the hardware is a lot more familiar now. I don't know that it's the best version, the graphics and sound are not on par with the Famicom, but it does have all 4 levels, so it has the advantage there. Otherwise, it's Donkey Kong. You know him, you love him. In 1986, Donkey Kong's Famicom port is localized worldwide for the NES. And while that is happening, a little home computer called the MSX is kicking it back in Japan, and it receives a little game called Penguin Adventure. And also Donkey Kong. Compared to things like the PC-8801 and the FM7, the MSX line of machines was far more successful, selling as many as 9 million units. And video games had a very substantial presence on the platform. Perhaps most famously, Metal Gear would get its start on the MSX before getting a very wonky NES remake. Now let's talk Donkey Man. The first thing I noticed was the graphics. It's definitely serviceable, but I think we've had versions that look significantly better by now. Take a look at Donkey Kong on the How High Can You Get screen. It looks like a PNG that got cut off by Twitter cropping. And in the actual game, he looks more like a burly chimpanzee than a mighty great ape. Right out of the gate, the game hits you with the single most bizarre default key setup I have ever seen in a video game, where you press P and I to walk and you go up a ladder by pressing Q. It is one of the strangest things I have ever seen in my life. But on the bright side, the game actually provides you with an option to remap the controls, right on the title screen. It was incredibly forward-looking of them to give you that option. Even today, the ability to remap buttons is not a guarantee. Switch Online. This is a very complete version of the game, containing all 4 of the levels and with all of the most appropriate sound effects and music the MSX can possibly muster. Maybe one day I'll make a video where I just create a tier list of Donkey Kong ports. And then we got Donkey Kong on the ZX Spectrum, not to be confused with DK Jr., which I spoke about earlier. It's DK on the ZX, ZK on the DX, DZ on EZ like Ouija with a squeegee eating a panini in a skeezy Mitsubishi. And it was very cheesy. Did you guys know that Donkey Kong 64, on top of having an emulator for the arcade game, also has a built-in ZX Spectrum emulator that lets you play Jetpack? That's probably my favorite game for the system, you know, out of the 3 that I played. This Donkey Kong is pretty similar to the MSX version, except the colors have that distinctive ZX Spectrum look. It doesn't look like the original game exactly, but it's very vibrant and pretty. Otherwise, I feel like this version isn't as polished as the MSX version. I can't even get to the last level because I keep dying whenever I climb the ladder on level 3, so I'm permanently stuck. But if I had to guess, the last level consists of walking over weak points to destroy the structure and kill Donkey Kong by falling damage. But again, that's only a guess. Donkey Kong for the Amstrad CPC, a system that I have never heard of in my life before now. It was a relatively successful machine, but not quite as much as the Spectrum and certainly not the Commodore. This is another surprisingly competent version of the game. It's stable, it's functional, it plays well, the graphics aren't perfect, but they're very close and all the levels are intact. It's funny, the more I see of these Donkey Kong ports, the more confused I get that the Famicom version couldn't get the second level. No other version so far can match it in terms of graphics or sound, but even then, more of them seem to have all 4 levels than not. As for the Amstrad CPC version, the most distinctive part of it is the sound. It sounds completely different from every other version I played so far, but not in an objectively bad way. It's instantaneously recognizable by the sounds alone. Donkey Kong Jr. for the Atari 7800. By the time this game came out, the NES was already on the highway to superstardom. Atari released the Atari 7800 a year after the NES and 3 years after the Famicom on which it was based. The 7800 had noticeably better graphics and sound capabilities than the 26 and 5200, which is cool. But you want to know which console that it couldn't compete with? The Famicom. That thing came out 3 years earlier. Sometimes I wonder if Atari had developed a certain arrogance by this point, like they thought, hey, come on, we're Atari, people will buy our stuff. But when it came out, consumers seem to have realized what Atari had not. They were old school. There's a new sheriff in town, and his name is Super Mario Bros. As for this particular port of DK Jr., it's far from the worst version we've discussed, but still underwhelming when you acknowledge the existence of the Famicom NES version. You gotta remember, by this point we've already seen Super Mario Bros., so Donkey Kong Jr. isn't even a real video game anymore. Not even the good versions. Like, fundamentally at this point, it's just looking more and more quaint. Also in 1986, Mario Bros. On the Famicom is localized for the rest of the world on the NES. Meanwhile, back in Japan, the Famicom is getting an upgrade. It's the Famicom Disk System, an add-on for the Famicom that stored games on floppy disks. There were a couple of advantages floppies had over cartridges, most notably the writability, which was utilized in Zelda for the save feature before they figured out a way to add that functionality to cartridges. Many of the games that were on the Famicom would be re-released on the disk system and vice versa. One such game is Tennis, and it's exactly the same, well la-di-f***ing-da. Then we got Tennis for the arcade. It's just tennis again! What are you trying to pull here, Wikipedia? Golf for the Famicom Disk System bears a striking resemblance to Golf on the Famicom. I'll be honest, the Famicom Disk System isn't exactly living up to the hype for me. Like, I'm pretty sure this is just Super Mario Bros. Alright, everybody calm down, I found an actual video game. Just like Super Mario Bros. Was revolutionary on the NES, it is also the greatest Game & Watch game that I have played so far. Using the crude Game & Watch technology in an exceedingly clever way, they have created the illusion of a side-scrolling level where you have to jump on platforms as they come and rescue Princess Toadstool at the end. Yeah, I said Toadstool, she ain't Peach yet. The game even has more than one level. You beat the game and the platforms are completely different the second time around. It is a very impressive effect. And best of all, it bleeps out the Super Mario Bros. Theme with single channel audio. Super Mario Bros. Arcade is, from what I understand, a straight port of Super Mario Bros. To the arcade, so nothing special. What is special, though, is Super Mario Bros. Special for my favorite console, the NEC PC-8801. I mean, it's got the word special right in the title, so good luck arguing that shit. This is effectively a reinterpretation of the original Super Mario Bros., but this time for the PC-8801 and Sharp X1 home computers. It is instantly recognizable. The sprites and music, although very obviously inferior to the NES game, are unmistakably Super Mario Bros. The true weakness of this version is the gameplay, which is not nearly as smooth as the original. The screen doesn't scroll, instead it just moves in huge chunks when you reach the edge. That type of thing would be tolerable in something like Dangerous Dave, but the level design of Super Mario Bros. Was built with scrolling in mind, so it doesn't really work in this context. The game depends on precise jumps, like how a platform you have to jump to will be sticking out of the side of the screen and you have to jump to it, hoping to God that you'll actually land and not fall off. It's especially bonkers when it comes to moving platforms, but the big advantage is the new levels. This is not an exact one-to-one recreation of the original, and it makes the game that much more interesting. I feel like this version of the game actually has a bit of a cult following. From what I understand, somebody actually made a ROM hack of the original game that recreates this version of that game, which is the funniest thing in the world. Maybe I'll talk about it one day. I am thinking about doing a summer ROM hack fan game marathon like I do in December, so maybe that would be a good time. It is worth noting that the game supposedly looks and runs better on the Sharp X1, but I can't seem to get that version to work at all. So for my money, I like this one better. VS Super Mario Bros. Is an arcade conversion of the NES game. Fundamentally, it's virtually the same, although some of the item placements seem to have been modified, and the overall number of mushrooms and fire flowers seems to be reduced altogether. I imagine they wanted to make the game more punishing to force players to pop more quarters into the machine. Also, they removed 2 blocks from this area on World 1-2. This was probably to prevent players from going to the minus world. Well, that's one way of removing a glitch. Just make it impossible to access it. There are some very subtle graphical improvements, like how the text has a drop shadow, but other than that, it's mostly the same. But it's a good video game anyway, so that's not really a problem. Up next, we got Super Mario Bros. 2! No, not that one. This one. The game known in Japan as Super Mario Bros. 2 would later come to the rest of the world as Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. Personally, I call it Super Mario Bros. Bastard Edition. The original Famicom version of this game was not made available overseas until years later, and when I played it for the first time as a kid off the Virtual Console, I could definitely see why. This game is bullshit. But before I get mad at it for being too hard, I gotta pay some major respects. Presentation-wise, there are a lot of noticeable improvements over the original game. The environments have a little more detail, like blades of grass and the happy little clouds. The bricks you walk on look more natural and not like 8x8 tiles copy-pasted next to each other indefinitely. There's a little screeching sound whenever you turn around. And it has new gameplay elements as well, like sometimes you bounce on an enemy and it launches you 80 feet in the air, or the trampolines that launch you up into the ozone layer. And right when you think you've seen it all, the game introduces wind as a mechanic. It almost feels like an unofficial ROM hack of the original game. Fundamentally, it's mostly identical in how it plays, but with all this new content. It's really cool. And with all of that out of the way, it's time for me to switch back to Angry Critic mode. Ass! Right at the start of the first level, the game tries to blue balls you with a super mushroom that can only be obtained by a very precise jump, and they even put a red Koopa Troopa to dissuade you from getting it, and not 2 seconds later, they introduce a new item, the poison mushroom, which kills you instantly. The original game was tough but fair. This game, on the other hand, is tough, but I ran out of words. If I remember right, I saw a single 1-up mushroom in my entire playthrough, and it despawned because I outran the screen because I was jumping across falling platforms. I especially love these Bowser levels where you have to walk through in a very specific order and fashion that is never outright told to you, otherwise it loops indefinitely. I'm pretty sure there were at least 1 or 2 castles in the first game that pulled this trick, But where it's less forgivable is in World 8-2 in Lost Levels. You have these invisible blocks that screw up your jumps, hammer bros, wind, very specific trampoline maneuvers, and right when you reach the end of the level, you go down an orange pipe, grab some coins, and then it spits you out way back at the halfway point because it turns out you went the wrong way, and what you were actually supposed to do was hit this block to spawn a beanstalk to the heavens, so all your time and effort was basically a complete waste. It's already a massive punch in the dick to have to repeat a series of extremely specific and difficult maneuvers to get another shot at the thing that killed you. But having to repeat all that because you went the wrong way in a seemingly linear 2D level that you can't walk backwards in is like tearing my heart out through my throat. From what I understand, there are warp zones in the game, but most of them take you back to 1-1. What the f***, Nintendo? After all of this nonsense, all of the insanely specific punishing lunacy, your reward is World 9, which is a series of 4 really weird experimental levels that you only have 1 life to beat. This is like the kind of stuff you'd find in an unreleased beta ROM from a once-in-a-lifetime Gigaleak. Maybe this really is a ROM hack. Super Mario Bros. 2 is extremely obtuse and punishing to the point that it almost feels like it wasn't play-tested sometimes. But if you're really burnt out on the first game and you think it's way too easy, this will be the game for you. Not to mention, if you're playing on the Switch Online service, you can just use the rewind feature, which honestly neither me nor God would judge you for that. Up next, we got I Am a Teacher, Super Mario Sweater. I have no idea what that's supposed to mean, but it's probably a very direct and literal translation, so perhaps I was never meant to know. This is an educational game teaching kids about measurements with the context of designing sweaters with different Mario-themed patterns on them. You could select measurements and design your own, which is actually pretty cool. This would be a much more interesting game if I could read any of the words, but it's a neat idea. I'm not much of a clothes person. My wardrobe generally consists of a hoodie and whatever pants happen to be clean at that time, but hey, it's Mario on a shirt. Ain't that crazy? The game was co-developed by Royal, a Japanese sewing company, and for the price of 2,900 yen, you could pay them to turn your patterns into an actual shirt, which I guess is where all the measurement stuff comes into play. That's a pretty cool feature, although I don't know how detailed you can really be with an NES design. All Night Nippon Super Mario Bros. Now remember when I said Super Mario Bros. 2 was like a ROM hack? Well, this one might be even more like a ROM hack. This is a modded version of Super Mario Bros. Based on a Japanese radio show called All Night Nippon, which started in 1967, and from what I understand, it's actually still on the air. The game itself was part of a prize giveaway for listeners of the show and had numerous changed assets to reflect symbols and imagery associated with the program. Having never listened to it myself, I cannot speak to its authenticity to All Night Nippon, but nevertheless, it's more Super Mario Bros., so it's really nice to have. All of the Goombas were replaced by this smiling dude wearing shades. I guess that's one of the hosts. Look, there's more of them. He's the Piranha Plants as well. I kinda wanna make my friends play this as a prank without telling them that it's based on a radio show just to see their reactions. Why are all the Goombas a bunch of disembodied heads with shades? What do you mean? That's the classic Mario character, Jimbo Mario. I'm starting to think you're not a real fan. Mario Bros on the Amstrad CPC. Not Super Mario Bros, just regular. This one is probably on the lower end of Mario Bros ports, mostly due to the sluggish controls. The audio-visual component is not phenomenal either, although I have to pay big respects to Mario's animations. They're a lot smoother than you would expect. But by this time, the NES was worldwide, so I don't know why you wouldn't just play that version instead. Mario Bros for the Atari 7800. Like most 7800 titles, this is a game that is serviceable, but also very underwhelming. It's an entirely playable version of the game, and the graphics do look better than a lot of versions, but not the NES version, and if you just look at 7800 sales versus NES sales, the chances that you had this version and not the Nintendo version are, to my estimates, roughly 3. Not 3%, just 3. Mario Bros for the ZX Spectrum. This is in the running for the worst version I played so far. The controls are so stiff and sluggish, it's barely functional. Graphically, it's distinct, but not in a good way. More like a ZX Spectrum way. And over here we got Mario Bros for the Commodore 64 again, this time by our old friend Ocean. From a presentation standpoint, this is a winner. It doesn't look exactly the same, but it feels less like a limitation and more like it became its own thing. And the music is pretty funky too. But they had to ruin it with one thing: the controls. Somehow it's extremely stiff and very slippery and glidey at the same time. It is next to impossible to play this game optimally. Slidiness was already part of the game, but this game made it less like a quirk and more of a legitimate problem. It's almost as bad as the Spectrum version, but I give the edge to this because at least the audio-visual component is much better. Up next, it's Family Computer Golf Japan Course. Now, with the original Golf, there was some debate over whether or not the man in the game really is Mario, and even I'm still a little skeptical of that official confirmation found in that Nintendo guidebook. This time, however, they made it as clear as humanly possible that yes, this is in fact Mario. They even put him on the box. You can't miss him. I'd say this is like the original Mario Golf, but that might be a bit too generous. As for the game itself, it's pretty much just golf on NES, except it supposedly takes place in Japan. Even though I've never been to Japan, I'm sure the golf courses there look exactly like this. I mean, it's a golf course. Is there really that much variety? One thing I can't seem to figure out is how to switch your clubs, which means if you end up in the bunker, you're pretty much screwed as far as I can tell. There must be a way to do it, but I can't figure it out. And naturally, we got Family Computer Golf, US course, because the only two countries in existence are Japan and the US. From what I can tell, the courses in both games consist of grass and trees and some sand, I guess. Maybe some water. Can people really tell that this is Japan and this is the United States? You could have called it Family Computer Golf Fredericton course and nobody would argue with you. One thing that bugs me about this version is that for some reason they abandoned the dual screen setup where one screen shows Mario and the other shows the map. That was a really convenient way of showing you everything going on all at once. Now it has to swap between the two, which is a lot less convenient. And now we bring out the big guns. It's Punch-Out! Gold version. This was a version of Punch-Out given to winners of a Famicom golf tournament in Japan. To be honest, I never really got the Punch-Out hype that a lot of people have. I guess it's because it was before my time. But after playing it again, I've actually come around to it. There's a very real rhythm to this game. It is not a button-mashing simulator. Every single boss is a puzzle you have to solve, like Zelda, and you need to get into the rhythm of dodging and hitting. But there's also the stamina meter you gotta worry about. So, learn the attack pattern, dodge and hit, and stamina meter. So it's pretty much just Dark Souls. But where does Mario come in? Well, he's the ref. Yeah, eventually Mario is going to referee every single sport imaginable. I'd say that this really is a damn good game now that I've actually figured out how to play it. To me, there should be way more sports-based video games like this. Sports games come out every year and instantly become bargain bin trash because that's what they always were. The biggest issue I have with these games is that they spend a ridiculous amount of time making the games hyper-realistic so that a bunch of dudes named Tyler will buy the game in between skipping leg day and hitting the bong. They have the least picky demographic in the world next to meth users, and for that reason, we have seen fewer and fewer sports games over the years that have even attempted to be unique or interesting. Punch-Out remains to this day to be an exception. The enemies in this game are ridiculous. You got Don Flamenco who says, "Hey Mario, I like your hair," and then there's the Great Tiger who can teleport. Yeah, that's fair. It is a little weird that they have this tiny 100-pound kid up against guys who are easily several weight classes above him, but in a video game, who cares? Fundamentally, this is the Punch-Out you're probably thinking of when you hear Punch-Out, but this particular version is not the Punch-Out. When people hear Punch-Out, what they're actually thinking of is Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. This is the exact same game as the other version, except the final boss is Mike Actual Tyson. Minoru Arakawa, who was the president of Nintendo of America at the time, had seen a boxing match featuring Mike Tyson and was completely floored by his athletic prowess. So he arranged to have the company pay him for his likeness in the game. Mike Tyson's tie-in is often credited for being the reason this game was so successful in the first place. What can you say? The guy was a beast. The game is the same as the non-Mike Tyson equipped versions with the exception of Iron Mike himself, but with or without him, I just can't get over how awesome this game is. It is a legitimately challenging experience that rewards attention and effort. I remember getting stuck on Great Tiger until I realized some of his attacks are telegraphed by the blinking jewel on his turban. I felt like a genius when I saw that. Besides Punch-Out, I cannot think of a game that can pull off being a legitimately polished boxing simulator while also having a character named Soda Popinski. Wait, why does he laugh like Ganon from Zelda 2? Before Mario Kart, there was Famicom Grand Prix F1 Race, where Mario drove around Formula 1 race cars. You start out with 50 monies and you buy a car that will hopefully let you win the Grand Prix. I am not at all good at it. Usually my tires would keep wearing down to nothing and I'd be stuck unintentionally drifting all over the place harder than a Joy-Con. It's kinda cool, but if it was deleted from history, I probably wouldn't feel too bad about it. DK for the FDS is DK for the F, except it's for the FDS, so it's DKDDDDT, which stands for Donkey Kong Dixie's Double Duplicate Disc Trouble. Up next, it's Donkey Kong for the 7800. I gotta say, I'm actually surprised that they were still making Donkey Kong ports as late as 1988, 7 years after the original game. Imagine that, it's like if they kept remastering The Last of Us or something. As for the game itself, the 7800 just isn't cutting it anymore, okay? The Sega Genesis is about to come out in a year. Come on, Atari, pack it up while you still have a shred of dignity left. DK Jr. for the Disk System, get out of here. The only thing more incredible than an Atari 7800 game coming out in 1988 is a game for the Atari 8-bit family coming out in 1988. This is real. It exists. I don't know why, but damn it, it exists. This is a bit tricky actually. I've seen two different games claiming to be the 8-bit family port of Mario Bros. One of them seems like a crappier version of the 5200 version with corrupted audio and weird graphical problems. But then the other one feels like the developers actually tried. Of course, try as you might, there's only so much you can do with Atari when you get down to it. From an audio-visual standpoint, this would have been great if it came out like 3 years earlier. It does have a real resemblance to the actual game and it plays okay, but the NES had already been out for a couple of years and it was substantially better than this. So if you wanted Mario Bros, you probably wanted the NES version, and if you got this, your mom probably hated you. Famicom Grand Prix 2 3D Hot Rally is a game that is leaps and bounds ahead of its predecessor. The original game was a top-down racing game with somewhat stiff controls and mechanics that I just could not get a hold of. This one is far more straightforward in comparison. It takes a third person behind the car perspective instead, which, that alone makes everything more intuitive. I think 3D was the dream for a lot of game developers, and they were experimenting a lot with pseudo 3D techniques, and the approach used here was pretty common for the time, even dating as far back as Atari 2600 with games like Pole Position. Graphically, the game is incredible for the Famicom, although there is this weird flickering issue with the UI that was actually so bad that it caused severe burn-in on my monitor, and I had to sit on a black screen for 10 minutes to buff it out. I'm actually gonna censor it now so I don't f up anyone else's screen by accident. That little doozy aside, this game is actually really good. I'm honestly surprised. I had a lot of fun with this one. I think the coolest thing about this game is that a single race can go for as long as 13 minutes. You keep driving along the open road, turning at one crossroad or another, and as you progress, you actually enter new areas altogether. Going over the desert, the grasslands, more open road, the city, there's a lot of variety here. It's also pretty mechanical. You have to change the gears manually by tapping up on the D-pad. You have to let go of the gas so that you can turn sharper corners. And you got these exclamation marks that let you activate a secret nitro gear that lets you reach speeds over 300 clicks an hour. This is an honest-to-God video game, and I really enjoyed playing it. It almost makes me sad that the only Mario racing game today is Mario Kart. I feel like Nintendo could do something wild with a straight-up speed-based video game like this, like a goofier take on Forza or something. I mean, they pretty much gave up on F-Zero, so anything would be welcome. Super Mario Bros.
Super Mario Brothers 2.
Yeah, that one. Now this is a weird one. A lot of you probably know this already, but this game was actually adapted from a game for the Famicom disk system known as Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic, aka Dream World Doki Doki Panic, or just Doki Doki Panic. It was initially made in collaboration with Fuji TV to promote an event they were hosting at the time using character mascots of their own. Due to licensing issues abroad, they could not release it outside of Japan. At the same time, Nintendo of America did not want to localize the version of Super Mario Bros. 2 that they already made, on the grounds that it was way too similar to the first game and was way too hard, which, you know, can't really argue there. So they came up with a genius solution. They took Doki Doki Panic and replaced the 4 playable characters with Mario, Luigi, Toad, and Peach, therefore removing any and all references to the Fuji TV characters, called it Super Mario Bros. 2, and released it worldwide. I mean, hey, if it works, it works. What's really cool is that almost all the other elements remained the same, and a lot of the enemies and secondary characters, which were not supposed to be Mario characters in the first place, would gain a permanent and substantial place in Mario canon, sending massive reverberations down the legacy of Mario. In spite of its bizarre origins, the game's impact on the franchise was huge. It's pretty wild to think that if they didn't make the decision to tweak this weird licensed game into Mario, things like Shy Guys, Sniffits, and even Bob-Bombs might not have become the major recurring enemies that we see today, not to mention Birdo. Then again, Donkey Kong was initially supposed to be based on Popeye, so I guess the world is just a crazy place. Now that I've actually tried the original game, I realize that it might not have been such a weird move after all. The game already had a lot of borrowed DNA from Mario from the get-go, with the coins and the POW blocks, invincibility stars, and even a lot of the sound effects as well. It shouldn't be surprising, the team that made it already consisted of several Mario men, including Mario Miyamoto himself, who at some point in development suggested making the game more Mario-like. It's almost like he knew what would happen from the start, or manifested it. Super Mario Bros. 2 itself is very well made. It's definitely different from the usual Mario affair. Instead of jumping on enemies to kill them, you pick them up, lift them over your head, and throw them into each other. It's so cathartic and satisfying. This is the kind of game you play to blow off some steam. You don't really get power-ups and fire flowers and whatnot. Just by being strong enough to lift enemies over your head and chuck them into each other, you're already powerful enough. The levels have a lot more interactivity. You can pull bombs out of the ground and blow up walls. You can stack things on top of each other to get extra height. There's a part where you have to wait for Birdo to shoot an egg, and then you have to jump on it and let it carry you into the Beyond realm. The 4 characters have different strengths and weaknesses. The atmosphere does have some of that Mario whimsy, but it's just weird enough that even if I didn't know about the development of this game, I might have guessed that it wasn't supposed to be Mario initially. You got a mouse with shades that chucks bombs at you like a crazy person. That guy's name is Mauser. Not Bowser, it's Mauser. I want to see him make a comeback. There's also blue hedgehogs as enemies, which feels oddly prophetic. There's a 3-headed dragon snake thing that looks like it came from Zelda 1, and the main antagonist is a big froggy guy named Wart who is such a picky eater that he literally dies if you throw vegetables into his mouth, and right when you think you've seen it all, you go to pull a turnip out of the ground and it turns out that that's actually a rocket ship and it blasts you into the sky. What is going on here? Why do we go from the desert fighting snakes in vases to bomb-wielding mouse men to an icy Arctic setting with whales to a forest of big-ass trees with rocket ship turnips that shoot you into Zeus's backyard in the heavens? Well, that's because the entire game is actually an elaborate dream sequence. Yeah, I'm allowed to spoil that, right? I mean, the game is like 35 years old or something. Even though it started as something completely else, it's really cool that they took Mario far beyond just Goombas and Koopas, already experimenting with the expanded lore of Mario this early in the game. What's funny about that is that the director of Super Mario Bros. 2 was Kensuke Tanabe, the guy who's been in charge of Paper Mario since Sticker Star. Ironic. But I guess that explains the abundance of Shy Guys. Difficulty-wise, I wouldn't call it an easy game, but it's probably easier than Super Mario Bros. 1, and definitely easier than Lost Levels. A lot of this is due to the checkpoint system, which is almost as generous as Grand Theft Auto 5. Of course, by the end, it does start turning into a dickhead like this stupid shit with the bombs, or this part where the bird portal decides it's not a bird portal at all and is actually a boss fight. Whose idea was that? I bet it was Miyamoto specifically. The 4 playable characters have different strengths and weaknesses, though I never felt any particular need to play as anyone besides Mario. I'm sure there's some metagame that I'm not aware of, but I didn't need it. Now that I've actually seen this game all the way through, I gotta say, it's surprisingly good, even today. There's an excellent fluidity to it that just isn't there in a lot of its contemporaries or successors, and in some ways, it's almost comparable to modern 2D platformers. It's challenging, but it's fair, and it's telegraphed. It's worth noting that there's also an arcade version for Nintendo's Play Choice 10 cabinets. These were machines that let you play NES games at the arcade, which is kinda cool. Supposedly, they were also part of a demonstrative marketing gimmick to let people get a taste of NES games before they were actually released in the West. From what I understand, the games are fundamentally unchanged, unlike the VS system titles, meaning that they weren't really designed for an arcade setting. I guess if it's mostly supposed to be a demonstration more than anything, that's not really a big deal. A single quarter will get you 300 seconds or 5 minutes of gameplay, which if you're an elite speedrunner, you'll only need 2 of those. But for most people, the internet tells me that it takes an average of roughly 3 hours to beat, and if you do the math, it costs $9 to beat the entire game. Not to mention being on your feet that whole time while there's a line of 50 people behind you who are all getting very agitated because the whole world loves Super Mario Bros. 2. Donkey Kong Classics is a double pack of Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. for the NES. And what's funny about this is that even though the cartridge has enough space to fit 2 entire Donkey Kongs, they still haven't added the second level. Jeez, get with it, Nintendo. Super Mario Bros. 3 is often considered to be the crowning jewel of the NES library, and for good reason. Even today, this is a legitimately good video game. For some people, their first exposure to this game was in the movie The Wizard, which is a mediocre road comedy about a mentally disabled kid named Jimmy who kicks ass at Nintendo. It's kinda like the Rain Man, except instead of counting cards, he's playing Double Dragon. The movie itself is a high-budget, feature-length Nintendo commercial where every other scene is the characters talking about how cool the Power Glove is. Yeah, sure thing. Imagine if they made this movie today. They'd get a 14-year-old kid dressed like Jake Paul to look at the screen and say, in the most sincere tone of voice possible, "Nintendo Switch, it's straight bussin', no cap. If you don't play it, you're a sussy baka and you are the imposter, and also Joy-Con drift is a myth." It's also an ad for Universal Studios theme park. There's an entire chase sequence where they run through all the rides and shit. Who would have thought that not even a decade after trying to sue Nintendo over Donkey Kong, they were now making movies together? And if you jump to today, they're actually distributing the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Some things never change. In the end, Jimmy becomes a finalist in a huge video game competition and has to play an entirely new video game nobody has ever seen before. And spoiler alert, it's Super Mario Bros. 3. Yeah. So all in all, The Wizard is a 2-star movie. Now, let's get back to Mario Bros. 3. It's, kinda good, I guess. In every single respect, this game is leaps and bounds ahead of every Mario game beforehand. The graphics and sound almost seem as though they could have been on a different console entirely. The music is incredible, there are a bunch of new enemies, there are a billion different items you can use, there's an overworld. Platforming feels a lot smoother and more reliable than ever, and on top of all of this, the game takes a different approach to difficulty. You still have fields full of nasty hitboxes flying all over the place and super precise maneuvers, but at least victory feels somewhat more attainable now. The wealth of new items and the fact that you can hoard and equip them before a level is a really cool move and opens the game up to a lot more experimentation. If you run at top speed, you can do a super jump, and if you have the Tanuki suit, you can actually use the super jump to fly and skip entire levels. In Super Mario Bros. 1, you can restart the world on a game over by holding B when starting the next game. In Super Mario Bros. 3, you go back to the beginning of the world, except they put these pipes everywhere, and if you got far enough before losing your lives, you can just go through the pipes and skip things you already did. The more forgiving checkpoints are one of the massive improvements of Super Mario Bros. 3 and the saving grace in a game that is far bigger than the original. The jump from Super Mario Bros. 2 to this game is so dramatic that it feels like it skipped 3 other games. It makes the previous games look like Donkey Kong on DOS. It's not absolutely perfect, you still have a bit of old school jank, and one time there was supposed to be a platform that I could jump on to beat the level and it decided not to spawn. But if you can look past the very incidental stupid crap, you will find this game actually holds up better than a lot of NES titles. Of course, there's no Soda Popinski in this game, but damn it, it's still really good. Much like the first game, this would become incredibly iconic and would be referenced countless times in future titles, especially the music. Also, in Super Mario 3D World, the winter music actually makes references to the sound effect that plays when Mario runs at top speed. So, would I call this the best NES game? Well, it's close, but I'm still partial to Metroid. But is it the best Mario game on the NES? Almost definitely. Kaitecta Mario Bros. Is a game that I assume is not actually pronounced that way, and is also an exclusive for the Famicom disk system. The loose translation of the title is Mario Bros. Have Returned, and basically the game itself is a heavily enhanced version of the Famicom port of Mario Bros. With improved controls and slightly better animations, not to mention these funny cutscenes in between. There's also this bonus slot machine that lets you get another round on a game over, which is pretty neat. The changes to this game are excessive, but also very cool to have. There aren't any radical game design changes, it's more like a slightly enhanced Game of the Year definitive edition of Mario Bros. But for the previous Famicom disk system titles, at least the ones that we've looked at, I have generally noticed next to zero enhancements, so this feels like one of the few where they actually tried. The year is 1989. After dominating the home console market for a few years, a war was brewing. So Nintendo decides to expand to previously unseen territory in the handheld scene. Previously, they had their Game & Watch systems, but those were more like toys than legitimate games. But then they brought out the mighty war machine, the Game Boy. This gray plastic brick would be the face of handheld video games for over a decade. This was not the first cartridge-based portable console technically, but considering its technical and cultural impact, it almost might as well have been. Even as late as 2009, I can remember people calling the DS and PSP a Game Boy. Of course, that started going out of style when phones became a thing. Even as handhelds started getting far more powerful than the Game Boy with actual color graphics and whatnot, Game Boy stood alone as being synonymous with portable gaming for years. And one of the first games for it was tennis. You know, my favorite game. This is kinda like the NES version, although tennis is tennis, so that's to be expected. The graphics are a lot more cutesy, with the characters having these big anime eyes, and there's actual music in it, which makes it more exciting. Mario also looks a lot more Mario-ish. Otherwise, I'm not particularly good at this game. It's a lot harder to be precise because it's a chunky game that was supposed to be played on a tiny little square of a screen. This was sadly a common condition for Game Boy titles, but it was a modest price to pay for portability. Pinball for the Famicom skip system. Now remember when I said tennis was my favorite game 2 seconds ago? Well, I lied. Golf is my favorite game. And Nintendo came through with golf for the Game Boy. Now I can be bad at golf on the go. This version is actually pretty cool because it has a save feature, which still wasn't something you could take for granted yet. It also has 18 US courses and 18 Japan courses, which is more than can be said for any individual Famicom version of the game. Remember, they had the US and Japan courses on completely separate cartridges. So to get 2 in 1? That's pretty baller, as the kids say. Wrecking Crew for the disk system is largely the same as the original version, but I forgot to mention a very important detail about it in the first video, so now is a good opportunity to fix my mistake. You see, Wrecking Crew has a custom level creator, where you get a big empty structure and you can put a bunch of things in there to create an abomination of level design that nobody should play. It's a lot of fun and very forward looking. Super Mario Bros. For the Nelsonic Game Watch. It's not the Game & Watch, it's the Game Watch. There's no question about it, that definitely is a watch. Unfortunately, I cannot find a way to play these games myself, but with something this obscure, that's something we gotta be realistic about, and if I am to be completely honest, it's kind of a miracle that this is the first time I've had this problem so far. As far as I can tell by watching some videos online, it's fundamentally the same as a Game & Watch in how it works, but a little more awkward because it's on an actual watch. It's more of a collector's item at this point than anything else, so mad props to anybody who actually has one. They also had Super Mario Bros. 2 and 3 and 4? Yeah, Super Mario Bros. 4. You guys know that game. I'd say I'm jealous of anyone who gets to play this thing for themselves, although I can't say I'm too cut up over not being able to play what is essentially a Game & Watch title. Super Mario Bros. 3 was ported to the Choice 10 system just like 2 was, but by this time I imagine anyone who didn't have the game on NES was probably trying to save every quarter they had so that they could actually afford the real thing. Baseball for the Game Boy. Now this is a tricky one. Baseball is, at a fundamental level, a more complicated sport than something like golf or tennis. There are a lot more moving parts, and it's easy to get lost in translation to a video game, and trying to put that in a Game Boy, I just didn't have a great time with it. There were baseball games on the NES as well, but they don't have Mario in them to my knowledge, and it's hard enough for me to care about sports even with Mario's involvement. But hey, you can play baseball in the car. Can't do this on Nintendo? Bitch, think again. And finally, it's the crown jewel of the Game Boy. Okay, I lied. It's Super Mario Land. According to the game's Wikipedia page, Nintendo CEO Hiroshi Yamauchi believed that fun video games promote console sales. I think that man was a genius. Because of that, they concluded that the boy needed a Mario game to carry it to superstardom, and out came Super Mario Land. The dev team was led by Gunpei Yokoi, creator of the Game & Watch and Game Boy systems, and was actually made largely without Miyamoto's involvement. When this came out, it blew people's minds. Super Mario Land wasn't a portable video game. It was a straight-up video game that was portable. It was a big adventure that was effectively a brand new Super Mario Bros. Title that you could take anywhere. At least that's what it probably felt like at the time. Okay, so it's not as big as Super Mario Bros. By the time this came out, Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, and 3, the original trilogy if you will, were already out on NES, and obviously this game wasn't quite on the level of those. But the standard for portable games has typically been roughly a generation behind the concurrent home console standards, like how the DS came out in the GameCube years and was like a portable N64, and the Nintendo Switch is like a 20% better Xbox 360. Super Mario Land follows Super Mario on his quest to save Princess Daisy in Sarasa Land. I'm starting to think this guy is a real floozy. What's going on here? Is he dating all three of them at once? Usually, Mario games are going to take you to the Grass World, or Sand World, Water World, Lava World, White World, or Snow World. So where do you go in Super Mario Land? Well, you go to China. This is definitely a weirder Mario game. Even though this is still the relatively early days of Mario, the direction of this game feels substantially different from its predecessors. Possibly even more than Super Mario Bros. 2. A lot of that may have stemmed from Miyamoto's lack of involvement. Koopas turn into bombs when you jump on them. Ninjas are enemies. There are fish skeletons that try to eat you. The piranha plants look more like electrical pliers. Seahorse boss fight. It plays the can-can when you get a star. And there are 2 levels where they say, "F*** this entire video game. This is now a 2D space shooter." The weirdness of Super Mario Land makes it stand out from your usual Mario affair and makes the game that much more interesting. Unfortunately, if you want to get at all that weird stuff, you have to suffer through some of the clunkiest gameplay I have ever witnessed in a mainline Mario title. In a split second, the movement can switch from too stiff to too sensitive. A subtle tap of the D-pad can send you flying off a cliff, except when you want it to. The collision is really wonky and difficult to judge, especially in the heat of the moment. Also, some levels are just dickheads, like this crap right here. Come on, you really think I'm gonna fall for that? At the end of the day, the gameplay is very wonky by today's standards and definitely didn't age as gracefully as its home console predecessors. But in spite of its compromises, it was a technical marvel, and just one of many stepping stones to much greater things. Mario has now conquered the arcade, the living room, and finally the long airplane ride. By now it was clear, the man was here to stay, and he spent years as the undisputed king of an entire medium, but a celebration of his victory would have to wait. For despite becoming the face of an entire industry, his place at the top was about to be threatened.